security architect and enthusiast with a strong background and skills in multiple areas of security, including application security, cloud security, and telecom security. Rohini is an experienced ethical hacker and has conducted secure development training classes for clients worldwide. Rohini is the current co-chair of the South Florida OWASP chapter, and she is also an AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Rohini.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me share my presentation. Can everyone see my presentation?
I can see.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. All right, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here on a Saturday. We really appreciate you taking the time to attend all these talks, and hopefully you'll get something out of them. We're talking about guardrails in the cloud, and going over the tables of content. I'll be starting off with the current landscape and the disruption that's happening right now. I'll cover the first guardrail with organizations and SCPs, the second guardrail to reduce blast radius, the third guardrail, how to implement least privilege, the fourth guardrail, which is automation, and then the fifth guardrail, which is threat detection. And then I'll basically go over everything, and then we'll put it all together. So without any further ado, let's talk about the current landscape as it exists right now. So 2020 was a really interesting year, and at Twilio, and as mentioned, I'm a member of the security architecture team at Twilio. Twilio did a survey last year, and what we found out was that companies had pulled in their digital strategy by 6 years, which is pretty phenomenal. So, and we saw that last year where, you had brick and mortar shops that had to go online. Your customer contact centers had to go online. We had e-education, virtual education. We were seeing our doctors online. So there's a lot of disruption happening right now. And what does that mean for sort of our overwhelmed security teams? Our security teams were already, we're sort of kind of underwater, and now it's even more so. So if you really did not have a cloud presence, and suddenly say you're going to go into like the AWS cloud or Azure or the Google cloud, we have a whole new landscape to protect and secure. There's compliance requirements, especially with sort of your e-doctor, your online doctor. There's HIPAA requirements, and there was a lot of, like I mentioned, there was a lot of innovation last year, and disruption that's happened. So there's so there's a lot of things going on, and really what's happening is, if you do not have guardrails, if you don't have a cloud strategy, a security strategy, you're going to be overwhelmed. And if we're already overwhelmed, we're even more so right now. So I'm basically going to talk about the AWS, the Amazon cloud, but really all these principles apply to any cloud. If you really any cloud that you go to, these same guardrails would apply. So in Amazon, when you get an account, the first thing what you do is on AWS, you start up an account, you log in, hopefully you set up multi-factor authentication. Maybe you spin up an instance or two, you open a bucket, and you do various services. You could set up subnets, you have a virtual private cloud, your VPC, which is your isolated section of the cloud. You could create like a public-private subnet. You start to set up route tables. You have things like security groups. You may set up like an RDS, a relational data store, or like a NoSQL database such as DynamoDB, and so on. So, there's like AWS is a complicated, environment. So it's kind of useful to have an analogy. So the way there's no really great analogies, unfortunately, with the cloud environment. The best one that I've seen is basically a real estate, like say you're a developer, say if you're a developer and you have a real estate developer, and say you're developing like a residential area, you're setting up a commercial, like a strip mall of some sort. So the way to think about is your accounts are like your parcel of land. So you bought up different parcels of land and you're going to do construction on them. So you can set up like say like a city. You have postal codes, which are your subnets. You have route table, which are your roads. Buildings, which could be say when you spin up machines, those are your instances. You have security groups, which could be say security guards outside the buildings that may or may not allow people to go into buildings. And then you have policies, things like what can be done. So if you don't have guardrails, if you don't have a clear strategy on how we're going to secure this complex environment, chances are it's not going to end well for us. There's been a lot of breaches in the cloud. We see, in security, we live in a very interesting environment. There's 0 days dropping all the time. There's breaches happening. We face anything from say very, script kiddies to like nation state attackers. We live in a very, in a constantly evolving environment. So we have to have a plan on how we're going to deal with this. So what are guardrails? So guardrails are a way to set security boundaries, right? So basically you're like, yeah, this is, this is what you can and cannot do. These are these are not sort of granular, very fine-grained boundaries. These are broad boundaries. This is a way for security, say cloud security teams, to let the engineering teams know that this is what you can and cannot do. As a member of the security architecture team, or just of the security team, our job is to set these guardrails and give our engineering teams a runway so they can run fast, so they can innovate. We just want to make sure that they innovate securely. We want to give them a very broad runway, but we want it to be secure. So guardrails are a really good way to do that, to set these boundaries. They're also a way to alert teams about security mistakes, and you can do that a lot with automation. It's also a way to train teams about cloud security. What's a good, what are the mistakes that can be made and what are the consequences? And it's also a way from being a blocker to enabler. If you have, going back to my real estate development analogy, if you have a building, you've got construction happening, people are putting up buildings, and if they have to come to you for every, hey, can we set up this building? Can we connect this building to this other building? Do I need a security guard here? How long is it just a night guard? Is it like, you're a blocker. Yeah, and there's no way we're going to scale that big. So we have to go from being a blocker to an enabler. And the way to do it is with setting these security boundaries. So some high-level things about architecting guardrails. Your guardrails should generally cover common use cases. So whatever your use cases are, and there are some that apply to everyone, which I'll cover. So make sure that these guardrails cover common use cases. So, you've taken care of, say, most of the questions that come up regarding security in the cloud. Make sure you give flexibility and optionality. We've always heard that security says no. So, we're going to either try and go around them, or we're going to go to them in the end, or, things like that. So you want to be flexible and give options. Just, if something can't be done, my advice is, give another option that could work for the teams. Guardrails really won't be, if your guardrails are not well understood, then basically they're not going to be very effective. So you make sure your guardrails are well understood and teams understand them. And then the final thing is they have to be enforceable. If you have guardrails that, and your car's going over like the side of a cliff, and the guardrail really doesn't protect you, then, what use were the guardrails? So make sure they're enforceable. So those are sort of the best practices, sort of things to think about when you are building guardrails. Okay, so let's talk about the first guardrail. So the first guardrail is specific to AWS, which is setting up organizations and SCPs, basically centralized control. If you don't have centralized control, if you don't know all your accounts, if you don't know all your resources, you cannot protect what you don't know. So you have to have a way to centralize this control. And the way to do it in AWS is through organizations and the use of service control policies, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few slides here. So organizations give us a way of managing multiple accounts from a central account using a hierarchical structure. And this is kind of what it looks like. You've got a root management account, which it sends invitations to all member accounts. Also, basically, what the first guardrail is, find all your accounts and get them and have every account be a part of this, or set up an organization, set up a management account which is separate, and then set up a decent hierarchical structure composed of organizational units and member accounts. So for example, a very simple organizational unit that you can do is, you can have a dev stage and a production organizational unit, because chances are you're going to have different policies that apply to different OUs. In a development environment, for example, teams are going to be, engineering teams are going to be experimenting, say they're going to be, trying out new services and playing around with. So you may want to give a little bit more control there, so you want them more flexibility there. Now, your production account, say you have a production OU, that has to be locked down, right? Because any breach there, any lack of any lack of security controls there, it could be catastrophic for your organization. So the first thing to do is set up an organization, have a management account, and find all your accounts and set up a good hierarchical structure. That's your first step. Specific to AWS. Organizations give you a number of other benefits. They do things like centralized billing, allow you to, as I've been talking about, centrally manage all your accounts. You can also push service control policies, which is very powerful, and I'll be talking about it in the next slide. You can configure services centrally, such as audit logging with CloudTrail. And then you can also ensure that all accounts have audit logging enabled and they cannot be modified. And then you can share things like Route 53 rules across all accounts. So they give you a lot of sort of benefits, and I hope you can see how powerful this is. Before I go into service control policies, one of the big things that you need to do with that management account, that's a very powerful account, right? Like that's a super account. You want to lock it down, and because it has special privileges. You can create accounts, you can invite accounts. If a attacker gets access to that account, well, they can get elevated privileges and things like that. So you really don't want that to happen. Also, the principle of least privilege and separation of concerns, which are general sort of security best practices, only use it for in administration. Don't run anything else in it, like an EC2 instance or anything else in this account. So so that and only limit access. This should only be given to the minimum number of access to the minimum number of users possible. So that's a management account best practice. Now let's talk about service control policies. These are very powerful, and it always surprises me when organizations are not using these, just because because of how powerful they are. So what are service control policies? So SCPs or service control policies set the maximum level of set of permissions that are allowed for all accounts in an organization. This is your guardrail number one, right? Like it's basically anything that if that's not in an SCP will not happen in your organization. Say you've said it. So for example, you don't want to run, say, Fargate, or there are some services you don't want to run, machine learning, something else. You can use SCPs to set this maximum set of permissions. So there are some useful policies that I would recommend. Things like, you deny root user. Don't allow any of your instances to have root users, because as mentioned, a lot of bad things happen. That root user has elevated privileges. You don't want to have local users on instances that run production workloads, right? You want to use things like federated authentication, and I'll touch on that a little bit down the road. You also want to only allow specific services. You don't, for example, and the reason for that may be that your team, that the cloud security team is not familiar, has not looked at that service, doesn't really know the best practice, best practices around that service. So you want to only allow specific services. And the way to do this is you can actually go and use organizations to see that what are the teams using right now. So you can actually do that, or you can talk to teams and so on, and get the list of specific services. Now, if teams want to use a service that's not allowed, they can contact the cloud security team or the security team, whoever's running, responsible for the security of the cloud, of services running in the cloud. And they can actually have a dialogue, and the team might do a POC and come up with some guidance around how to secure that new service and add that to the SCP. You also want to deny, you might want to deny ability to create access keys. I think in the keynote, speech that was just given, that's a real issue, right? Like we've seen a lot of breaches happen because people have checked access keys into code repositories, and mostly by mistake. We also, there's a very famous case of where a company got wiped out. Basically, they had to shut down because somebody got access to their keys and actually just started deleting stuff, and basically and that company went out of business. So there's been some extreme cases of really bad things happening when people lose access keys. You also might since organization is setting up organizations and SCPs is a foundational guardrail, you want to deny accounts the ability to leave an org. There's no reason that any account that's owned by your organization should not be part of that org, right? So you can deny the ability to leave an org. You might also do specific things like deniability. Say you have a backup OU. Say you've set up a backup OU, or you have a backup account where you do all your backups and so on. You want the ability to deny the ability to delete S3 buckets. You do not want your S3 buckets deleted. So because those are your backups. So just this example I just gave of this company that lost managed to lose their access keys and went out of business, that prevents that scenario, at least with backups. And then you may also do things like use approved regions, and you may need to do that for compliance reasons, that only specific regions that your team members or engineering teams cannot spin up accounts and services in unapproved regions. So service control policies are very powerful and should absolutely be used as guardrail number one. Some issues that I should mention about SCPs, currently there is no good way to audit an SCP. So, for example, you can set up an SCP or service control policy, but you don't really know it could actually break something. So one of the best practices is to set up, like I said, set up that hierarchical structure in a coherent fashion. And you want to set the SCP at the lowest OU and then test it, make sure it doesn't break anything, and then you can move it up. I also talked about finding unused services, and organizations can be used to do that. And then you also want to make sure you understand what SCPs are. SCPs don't give you permissions, right? They only set the maximum boundary for permissions. You still have to get permissions. They just set up the guardrail, the maximum boundary, and they only apply to accounts within an organization. So, like I mentioned, all accounts should be within in your organization's structure. They will not, because SCPs don't apply to any accounts outside your organization. So, for example, if you have a trust relationship with an account outside this organization, it's not going to apply there. All right, so we've done guardrail number 1, and you know, so you've set like this guardrail, you set the maximum, you've created a hierarchical, you found all your accounts, and you've set up this coherent hierarchical structure, and you've set SCPs, you've set the maximum permissions for all accounts in your organization. The second guardrail is to go multi-account. You don't want to put all your eggs in a basket, right? For example, going back to my analogy of like if we're developing real estate, if we only have a parcel of land, say in Tampa or where I'm in South Florida, you know, and a hurricane hits us, we're out of business. So you kind of want to, you may want a parcel of land somewhere else, you know, and or we get breached, we get attacked and breached because we haven't set guardrails. Well, the blast radius is limited only to that account. So as a best practice, you want to be multi-account. Also, it makes total, and another reason is it ties in with the first guardrail. The first guardrail doesn't work if you only have one account. So you want to have multiple accounts. It's a great way of organizing your related workloads and policies. For example, you know, like I mentioned, if you have a compliance account, you can actually make sure and you can enforce you know, those policies using SCPs. A backup account, for example, that I touched upon, that you can't delete any objects in any S3 buckets. Your keys, you want, you know, enhanced alerting. Their production also, you want enhanced alerting. And in a development, you may want to get them the ability to create new services, because teams may be, for example, you know, maybe experimenting with new services, seeing if they work. The other reason to go multi-account is it's easier tracking and alarming. I've already touched upon the fact that you minimize your blast radius because you've set up, you know, relevant security boundaries. And say you get breached, you can destroy that account, start over. And the other thing that you know, that you may come up again if you really start using AWS in a big way, is that AWS has some hard limits on primitives like S3 buckets, VPCs, the number of VPC peering connections you can set, and security groups, and so on. And this is something that, you know, when you're starting out is not a big deal. When you start using AWS in a big, you know, in a big way, you will certainly come up against that. So if when you have multiple accounts, you know, you don't hit these limits because you've got other accounts, you know, you've distributed sort of these quotas across multiple accounts. You can look up the AWS documentation on quotas and you'll get all that information there. Okay, so now we've set up guardrail number 1 and 2. We've set up organizations. We've gone multi-account. We've distributed our risk. We've minimized blast radius, and we've set up some really great guardrails with SCPs, service control policies. So we're already in much better shape than we were before. So I am in least privileged, and this is an area where a lot of security issues occur. You know, so identity and access management, right? Like who you are and you know, and what you're entitled to do is a global service. You know, you have things like users, groups, and roles. Users and roles are identities. Groups contain multiple users. You can't authenticate as a group, but you can attach policies to them. And roles are sort of can be adopted to assume. You can do an assume role to assume permissions. You get a temporary set of permissions to access various resources if you've got the right policies. So I'll talk a little bit about a policy. This was a sort of a sample policy that's created that basically gives an access to all speakers, the ability to put their presentation in a BSides bucket, right? Like we've got like so policies are a JSON representation of who can do what to which resource. So the who is the principal. In this case, it's anybody with a speaker role. So for example, I would be able to put this presentation in a BSides bucket. What they can do would be the action, which is I can do a put object, and which resource is the resource, which is the BSides bucket. So these are our JSON policies. They're very powerful, but they're also a source of privilege escalation attacks. And so one of the third guardrail is to implement least privilege. So a lot of issues can happen when you do things like you know, especially with the wildcard, with the if you have a wildcard. So if anybody, if instead of in the principal, instead of having just the speaker, anybody with a speaker role, if I just had a star, that means anybody can put anything in a bucket, in this bucket. Well, there's been cases of that being attacked. So for example, I could distribute malware. I find this policy, I'd upload malware, and I could say, hey, you know, send a survey to, like, say, all the BSides, you know, to people I know attended this talk or this conference, and say, hey, please go and download this from the, here's the talk, please download this. And they could actually effectively be downloading malware because I have this problem, because I put a wildcard as a principal. So there's many things. There's a number of things to be worried about when you have teams creating, you know, implementing policies. You want to look for things like wildcard, any action against any resource, allow for any principles, things like destructive delete object, you know, things like destructive privileges. And then things that attach role policy to a user group or role. And so, because what that means is, if that's in my policy, then I can give myself an administrator role and basically do privilege escalation. So policies are I hope you can see how hard it is to audit these. You know, these are not easy to audit, and they've been a source of a number of issues and breaches within the cloud environment. And so the suggestion is that if you're going use a tool like, there's a couple of open source tools out there. The first one is by Salesforce called Policy Sentry. What it does is it creates new policies with least privilege. It leverages AWS documentation on actions, resource, and conditions, and you can set up automation so when your teams are creating policies that they use this tool, so you're automatically creating new policies with least privilege, which is a good thing to do. Now, say you have a lot of policies already out there. You know, you want to scan for privilege flaws, and one of the tools is by Rhino Security Labs called AWS Escalate. That'll look for things like attaching policies, like attach role policies, and flag those. So that's your second guardrail. Guardrail is basically make sure you're implementing least privilege. You've actually checked your other policies and make sure that there is no privilege escalation vulnerabilities in any of these policies, and new policies are being created with least privilege. This, like I said, this is a very important one. This is also a source of a lot of friction with cloud security teams. You know, when engineering teams are setting up new workloads in AWS, you know, typically sometimes what happens is, just to get things working, they give very broad privileges. You know, they're not really looking at security. They're just trying to get the functionality working. So you really want to set this guardrail in place that everything happens with least privilege. And you don't, and these are very difficult to audit manually. So you really don't want to do that. So that's your third guardrail, least privilege with IAM. Now let's talk about the fourth guardrail. You know, asset management's hard anywhere you go, and I've yet to see anybody do it well. You know, because that's hard to do. And the way to do it in AWS is through tagging. So what tagging in AWS is, you have the ability to assign metadata to a lot of your resources, not all, but most of your, like things like EC2, and they're basically a key value pair. And you can use tagging for a number of things. It's not just for security. You can use it for governance. So, for example, you've got an account that's handling, say, credit card numbers, right? Like, so might fall in scope for PCI. You can actually put that tag in, say, yeah, this is a compliance, and the compliance that this instance falls under scope is PCI. You can do finance, that's a big one, and a lot of you can do you've got denial of service, but you've also got denial of wallet attacks in AWS, because you get billed for absolutely everything you run there. So you have to make sure that you're watching your costs there as well. Another big advantage of tagging is that it enables automation, and it actually can be used in IAM policy conditions, which is very, very powerful. Some useful tags with tagging is, obviously want the owner, so who owns this account, who owns this resource, who owns this EC2 instance, who's the owner of this bucket, things like that. So you want so that's a really good tag to have. The cost centers is a pretty ubiquitous tag. That's something, again, for financial reasons you might want in there. The risk classification is something I mentioned with the, with, say, like an instance is actually processing credit card numbers. You'd want to put, say, you might want to put the PCI tag on it, a description of what that resource is doing, the date created. That's a good one, because you may want to, to bring down your cost, you may want to let instances, say, in a development environment, only run for a certain amount of time. So that's a very good tag to have. An environment tag's a good one that says, yep, this is running in a development environment, this is running in a production environment, and then department and so on. So there's you can do a number of tags. This is a good sort of place to start with tags in your environment, and then you can always add more tags that are relevant to your organization. So tags are a great way to do ABAC, which is attribute-based access control. So you can use tags and policies to grant access only when, say, for example, when a certain tag has a matching value. In this case, that I can only start and stop instances if I'm on that project and I'm in that department. Nobody else can do that. So this can all be done automatically using conditions and policies. So tags are a very powerful way to do ABAC. And then what should be automated? So any place where you do not have service control policies or other policies enforcing your security guardrails, you can use automation. So I mentioned, if you have if you have instances and test accounts or resources and test accounts running for, say, whatever number of days, hours or days, you can delete those, right? Like they can only run for those. You can use automation to detect and remediate open security group. For example, if you have a security group that really shouldn't be open, but it's got 0000/0, or it's open up to insecure protocols like FTP or so on, you can use tagging, or you can use automation to detect and remediate those. You can find things like unused roles and services. Again, good thing, reduction of attack surface, right? Like always a good thing for us to do. Also, bringing down your bill, and which in AWS or in other clouds is a big issue. You can also use automation to update your asset management. Say you have an asset management system, you can use automation to update that, your CMDB with say your cloud assets. So really, the sky's the limit. If you have a plan and you have specific security controls you want to enforce, that you can use automation for that. So that's really great. There's a couple of things you can use. This blog that AWS published, and Parliament, which is an open source tool that's basically scraping a lot of AWS documentation and giving you information, so you don't have to go read that documentation. So useful when you're setting up automation. So guardrail number 5. So the fifth thing that I recommend doing is setting up GuardDuty and threat detection. So GuardDuty is AWS's regional threat detection service. So essentially, the problem in AWS is you're going to have a lot of noise. Say you've turned on logging, you've turned on CloudTrail, you've turned on CloudWatch. There's a lot of noise, and there's so much noise that it's almost impossible to figure out the signals. And GuardDuty really gives you a good way to detect signal from noise. It's integrated with organizations, which is great because it's basically if you've set up organizations, you can designate one of the accounts as your main account for GuardDuty, and invite all other accounts to be managed by that main account. The way GuardDuty works is it monitors data from different logs such as VPC flow logs, your DNS logs, and CloudTrail, which as I mentioned, has a lot of noise. It has a lot of great information, but a ton of noise. And it uses machine learning. So what they're doing is they're using machine learning to figure out what your baseline is, what is good traffic normal behavior from attack behavior or anomaly, right? Like, we've never seen you do this. And they also get data from a lot of feeds, things like malicious IPs that are running command and control, centers and things like that, or they're known to attack, instances. So they're basically marrying machine learning and feeds in GuardDuty. So it's a very, very powerful tool, and something that if you haven't turned on, you probably should. If you have your own threat detection service, that's great. I think you can absolutely use that, or you can, if it doesn't do everything that you want to do, you can use a combination of both. So that really is the fifth guardrail. So other best practices. Logging and monitoring, if you don't know what's happening, you're absolutely blind. And as a security team, if you're doing cloud security, you have to know what's happening in your cloud environment. Are you getting attacked? Who's attacking you? What's going on? Did something violate one of our guardrails? How do I need to remediate that? So you have to set up logging and alerting. My suggestion is you can basically bring in all your audit logs, your security logs and things like that into your company's SIEM, whatever you're using, and set up sort of alerts and things like that there, because most security teams are already used to using the system, so you might as well just use it for your cloud logging and alerting as well. Another best practice is use a separate AWS account and region to back up your data. Again, separation of concerns, least privilege, things like that. That's a good practice. I mentioned things like don't have root users, don't have access keys, things like that. You use federated access, single sign-on for all access. Don't have local users on production account. There shouldn't be any need to have local users. You can do things like block, S3 buckets are a source of breaches for a lot of corporations. It's almost constant. We've even had countries get breached by open S3 buckets. So one of the things you can set up in an SCP is block public access. So you can actually give access to, say you do have buckets, that do need access, let them, and then block public access for all future buckets. You could also consider using a web application firewall for like layer 7 attacks. AWS has one, but there's a lot of, at this point, really good WAFs out there. So you could consider using that to look for layer 7 attacks, OWASP top 10 type attacks and other attacks. And they're also pretty useful for doing things like rate limiting. And then you have things like AWS Shield for denial of service attack or A Shield Advanced in AWS. The other recommendation is to use infrastructure as code. You don't want to hand roll all of this out, and you don't want to be clicking buttons on an AWS console to set up services. You absolutely want to do something like Terraform and use infrastructure as code. That's code that can be audited. You can do security reviews on that. You can do automation on that. So that's absolutely a fundamental thing. Have infrastructure as code. And then AWS has rolled out their metadata service version 2. As you know, there was an SSRF attack in AWS that was pretty egregious. So so the recommendation is to use metadata service too. So that's some other best practices that you can do. And there may be other practices that may apply. There may be other things that are relevant to your corporation, to your organization, that may become a guardrail, which is a perfectly fine thing to do. So let's recap what happened, because I know I went through a lot. So going back to our analogy of parcels of land and construction going on in parcels of land and no guardrails, where you're being asked, can we do this? Can we do that? Can I set up this building? Can I just set up this building here? Can I open up a road here and there? When you've done guardrail number 1, if you're that was setting up organizations and SCPs, you've set up a hierarchical structure. You know where all your parcels of lands are, so you, and going back to guardrail number 2 as well, you've set up multi-accounts, you've got separate parcels of land, and they're all in this organization, and you've set up relevant SCP. So that's a very powerful things, 2 steps that you've done already to limit your blast radius, to set up guardrails, to set up maximum permissions that cannot be violated in any way. Guardrail 3 was you've implemented least privilege. So all the people who are who occupy your parcels of lands, who live in these cities, you've already implemented least privilege for them. So you've set up tools in place that to implement least privilege. Guardrail number 4 was all your resources because you've implemented tagging and you've set up automation to manage scale, because very quickly you are going to have so many resources and services and workloads running. There's just no way to audit this. So automation is a great way to go to manage scale. And then we've set up threat detection, right? We've got sort of a command center where we're looking at all the threats. We're getting all these feeds from GuardDuty, from where we're like, oh yeah, that instance is being attacked. It's communicating with the known malicious IP, or there's data exfiltration going on, or that bucket has a policy that was never there. So you've set up threat detections. So you're already in a really good place with these guardrails. And that's it for today. So you can reach me on LinkedIn, and I guess I am now open for any questions that anyone may have.
I think just as a reminder, we can use the Q&A panel if you have any questions.
Just as a reminder, if you look at the chat area, there's a question and answers area where you can put in your questions for today's discussion. Questions in reference to the recording of this session. That is something that I will talk to Lori and Brent, Derek about, and see about availability. I know last year we did share the presentations as part of BSides, so that's something we will have to follow up back up on. That's the only question I see in the chat so far.
Okay, wonderful. Please feel to contact me if you have any questions. If you think of anything afterwards, I can be contacted on LinkedIn or anywhere else, and happy to answer anything that comes up even after the conference.
Well, thank you so much for presenting at the Cloud Track. This is only our 2nd year actually offering the Cloud Track. It's supported by our CSA Tampa Bay chapter. So thank you very much for participating, and It was a very good presentation, and I know I learned a lot from it. So thank you so much.